Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Tanaka, and I am the VP for Event Programming for the Cyber Risk Alliance. On behalf of the InfoSec World community, we are thrilled to welcome you here today. Thanks for standing by, and welcome to today's presentation. During today's event, attendees will be in listen-only mode. However, if you do have a question, you may submit it via the Q&A button located toward the center of your screen. Questions are kept private and will only be viewable by the event staff. Questions will be addressed during the presentation throughout, as well as at the end of the presentation, time permitting. Questions that are not addressed during the event will be compiled and sent to the presenters for review. Also, please feel free to interact with the chat panel. Chats will be visible to all attendees and discussion is encouraged. CPE certificates will be emailed directly following this event. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our esteemed speakers today. First, we have Scott Giordano, Senior AI Privacy and Cybersecurity Attorney at Giordano Law. We have John Bates, Senior Manager, Cybersecurity at EY. John Barker, VP, Strategic Planning and Thought Leadership, Bonar Institute. And David Patariu, Privacy Attorney with Venable LLP. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Scott to start a discussion.
Wonderful, thank you, Chris. And I just want to welcome everyone to our presentation, Considerations for Conducting Artificial Intelligence Impact Assessments. If you have not been asked to do one of these, you undoubtedly will be shortly, so hence this presentation. And if you leave with nothing else, these are a couple of things we'd like to leave you with, in particular, that AI risk assessments are necessary, and they're, as I mentioned earlier, are going to be on the way. You're going to be asked to do them. And it's something that it's going to vary by jurisdiction. So we're going to talk about potentially the different jurisdictions and what they're going to be asking of you. And at the end of the day, this is going to look very much like other risk assessments, but yet it's going to be distinct. So with that, and by the way, I know some of the questions we typically get is, will this presentation be available at the end of the presentation to all of you? And the answer is yes. And then also, if you have questions, please ask them as we go throughout our presentation. We love getting questions. And also, this team will be at InfoSec World in the fall. So if you are going, please do connect with us. So without further ado, let me go to the next section, and that is why risk assessments for AI. And to talk about this subject is David. So David, why don't you take the floor from here?
Scott, thank you so much, and welcome all of you. And again, look forward to seeing you at InfoSec World this fall. And just kind of thinking about this topic, we do a lot of assessments every day, and now we're tasked with doing AI impact assessments for these new technologies that have come out in the past year. And I'd like to ground this because a lot of the talk is kind of generally high level when other panels kind of talk about this sometimes. And so imagine, right at this time of year, most people, they're thinking about a summer trip, a road trip to go somewhere. And when you do that, you kind of think through in your mind, what are the things that I need to do? What are the things I need to check my car? I need to make sure I have gas. I need to, and why are you checking to make sure you have gas in the tank before you leave? Because you don't want to get stuck on the side of the road. So you're trying to mitigate that risk. And so as you go through this and you think about why you have to do an assessment and what you're doing, sometimes the task seems very daunting and it seems very big. Like, I don't really understand this. Where do I start? Where do I end? But if you kind of ground it and think about, hey, look, I do risk assessments for other things in my life every day, whether it's taking a trip or going on a business trip or something else. And it's a matter of breaking it down and thinking about, okay, what are the things I know I have to do internally? And then what are the things I'm required to do? So like in my road trip example, if I have small children, I'm required to have them in car seats. And so it's no different with some of this AI regulations. So if you look here, some things are explicitly required and some things are necessary. So the EU AI Act, depending on where your AI system or your AI service sits, you may be required to do impact assessments. The same thing, there's other regs too. And right now, you should all know out there that there are a ton of regs that are sitting there waiting to be voted on, approved. So these are just a few examples. But in the coming year, there's probably going to be a lot more to think about. And certainly many of them will have some sort of requirement that you examine the systems before you release them, and you do some sort of an assessment or before you roll them out into the world. So that's kind of, there's also other regulations where you have an overlap. So if you want to think about privacy regulations like the GDPR, and you say, well, how does that impact my AI system? It's like, well, gee, you may have personal data in the training set. And so, of course, you're going to think about, well, what are my obligations to handle that? And how is my company handling that? And so as you do your assessment and as you look through each of these different regulations, you might do a crosswalk where you put them together and you say, these are all the things I have to think about before I release this new product or service into the market. And these are the things I have to continue to think about to make sure they're working properly. So now we can talk about these other risk assessments that you may already be doing that you can leverage. There's privacy impact assessments, there's DPIAs, there's LIAs, there's transfer impact assessments. So all of these things can be a source for information to help you build your privacy impact assessment. You may already be collecting a lot of this information when you roll out a new product or service. And so you can also, you can kind of leverage that and put that into your AI impact assessment. Now, certain regulations are going to have categorizations and are going to require you to think about different things. And here we have the EU AIA, and they categorize AI in different ways. And so you can look at the slide, or slides are downloadable afterwards. But the goal here is that there's different risk levels depending on the kind of system you're rolling out. So, for example, a chatbot is considered limited risk. Now, I will say, you still probably want to consider doing an AI impact assessment, even at the low risk level, because even at low risk levels, something like a spam filter, if it's not trained properly, can cause a lot of damage to your organization. So again, you want to kind of do your diligence at each level, and then maybe at the higher risk level, you do an additional impact assessment, or you do a more sophisticated one that covers a lot of different areas. So let's see here. And so there's a list here for requirements for high-risk systems. I'm just going to touch on something like the quality and relevance of data sets. Let's just touch on one thing here and how you would think about this in your impact assessment. You would want to start asking questions like, hey, where's my data coming from? How is it being trained? What's the source? Do I have the right consents? And so go through that diligence when you're actually thinking about either using a model or building your own model. So that's kind of some of the things, and you can look through these, and that's aspects of what you want to consider when you're doing this. And so here's another slide with some examples of AI assessments and templates. Microsoft has a very good one, and these are all starting points. They're going to be customized for your organization, your risk, the way your system works. So now here, what happens if you don't look at the risk? And these sets of slides, I'm going to try to get through these really quickly because we don't have a ton of time, but you may be in the kind of environment where people say, well, gee, we're not going to do any kind of assessment unless we see regulatory action, or we're not going to do any kind of assessment unless it's absolutely required. Well, here's what happens in some of those situations. You have this one case, U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission v. iTutor Group. And so what they were doing, they were using an AI system, and it was kicking out people that were over a certain age. And it says, listen, if you're over 55 or you're over 60, we're not going to look at those resumes, which is terrible, right? It's a violation of equal employment opportunity laws here. And so, the agency here came down on them and criticized them for how they were handling that. Would an impact assessment have helped there? Absolutely. So here's another example here, the Snap My chatbot investigated by the UK ICO. And so one of the ICO's findings was that they had not adequately assessed the data protection risk posed by the chatbot. So again, you can see regulators saying, okay, well, what do you do? How are you assessing the risk? What's taking, and some of these examples are just included so that if you're in that meeting and someone says, oh, no, you don't need this, or why are you slowing down our process for this? You can use some of these cases to help make a case for doing an impact assessment. Finally, there's other issues around data quality. And so something you need to think about is what's the regulatory environment? So we have the Global Privacy Assembly's International Enforcement Group, and they've issued a joint statement about scraping. And so one of their concerns is that or they consider scrape data, mass scraping events, a data breach. Well, think about where your data is coming from and take this 2 steps down the line and say, gee, if I'm using data from a mass scraping event and someone has packaged that and has put it out there for sale or something else, what is a regulator going to say to you when they find out that you're using that? Or what is an investor going to say? And so that's part of the things you want to think about as you're doing your assessments. And you can see how this plays out. The Italian Garante They fined one company $20 million because the data they were using and the information used did not have the right consent. Would an impact assessment have ferreted that out and helped them understand it? Most likely. Finally, you should appreciate that sometimes regulators are in flux and they're not always on the same page about scrape data or other types of data uses. And that's because this area of the law is so new. And so you should appreciate, for example, here we have the Dutch DPA. They're saying, look, any scraping is a problem. Well, in your impact assessment, that might raise red flags. Yet the EDPB is saying it might be covered by legitimate interest. So those are some things to think about as you're preparing these assessments. And so now I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague, John Bates, and he's going to talk more and get more into depth about this. I hope this is helpful.
David, before we switch over to John, real quick, just wanted to pause for a second, see if there's any questions. If there are, please send them in. Again, we love getting questions. And then I have one question for you before we move on, and that is that right now with the state of scraping, my understanding is that it's still very much unsettled law. I mean, there's arguments for both sides, but I understand that scraping is, there's no legitimate basis for scraping under EU law. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, there's some back and forth about that, and I think there's been opinions about that. I think generally the point of this kind of part of the talk is that you want to know what data your model is trained on. And as part of your impact assessment, you need to think about, like they say, you are what you eat. Your model is the data it's trained on. And so you have to really look at that and make sure you're considering that when you're looking at the AI as a whole, because the data that it's trained on can introduce biases and introduce other issues. So if you really don't understand that, you might be inheriting problems down the line. And that's part of what your AI impact assessment is supposed to help you understand and appreciate that risk.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason I'm asking that follow-up question is because potentially if you take scrape data, as I think you implied earlier, and you build this entire product around it, potentially they may not be usable in the EU, and it potentially may not be usable even in the US here, and you may have to throw the entire thing away, which is a pretty scary prospect and something that potentially, if nothing else, should show up in the risk assessment.
That's right. They call it, the FTC has done that. It's called algorithmic disgorgement, a big word. But it means that you have to kind of throw the whole thing out if you didn't have the right consents and everything else. But with that, on to John Bates.
All righty. Good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for having us. I appreciate it. Wanted to start out and just how do we get through these types of assessments? Where do we have past information that's going to help us, and then what are some of the best practices? So first and foremost, I want everybody to realize that AI is going to be in every single product, no matter if it's really there or not. It's a marketing term at this point. So it's going to be in printers, it's going to be in HVAC, it's going to be in productivity tools. Everybody is going to have it. And when you start thinking about doing assessments, you're going to have to realize that everything's going to have it. So then you've got to start thinking about, how am I going to deal with the fact that everything that's going to be procured is going to come in this manner? Now, what I do is I want people to analogize to recent history or events that are similar, so that we can follow the same path that we learned, okay? Because we still have a lot of the same issues we have, that we had in the past. So for instance, we have limited resources. There's too many reviews, right? If you think about third-party risk management, right, which is kind of a high analogy. And with this, as the team is talking about, there's high risk. There's high risk in terms of reputation, that you don't want to get known as, and you fill in the blank. You don't want the massive fine. And at the same time, you have to allow the business to work at a speed that helps them move ahead in this. You cannot stop it. Cyber and legal cannot be the Department of No. You have to figure out how to do it. And at the same time, you have to start thinking about what an AI incident would look like. Not just a pure cyber, but an AI. And you're also going to face fear from many departments in regards to this matter. So legal, compliance, risk, privacy, right? And so we have to get to some point where we're triaging the information. So here are the things we've got to do, I believe. You cannot have this go on forever. You cannot paralyze the business through your review and your governance process. We also have to focus the right people on the right things. We can't be looking at everything. We can't boil the ocean. The other thing is we have to be able to be agile. And that means we thought something was low risk and now it's high risk. We thought it was high and now it's low. You've got to be able to do that. I also think that you have to start with something that works. Do not pick the most complex, legal, technological use case for AI. Not going to be where you want it. You want to hit a bunch of singles before you start adding more difficulty and higher risk. And again, much like we know on almost all cyber fronts, data classification, high value assets, if you don't know this is going to be yet another mirror that it's going to hinder you. So think about that in your own organizations. So what do? Best practices indicate use what you have. Do not build a new wheel. Do not build a new process. That is not good from a change management or a risk management perspective. So use your ARB, your PIAs, as they were already talking, third-party risk legal reviews, okay? And try to, within reasonable, accuracy, try to determine what that risk looks like. I'm going to give you some examples so you can do that. And then with the various ways in which you look at the risk, then apply appropriate reviews to that, right? And as I said, you have to be able to move this up and down. The agility is going to be very important because it's new to everyone. And so your journey of getting information is going to move you in a different direction. And at the same time, the organization really has to educate everybody who's involved in this process. What I consider to be a big fork in the road that organizations have to incorporate into their process is this an AI software? Meaning it's software with AI. Like I said, everything's going to be that way. Is it a printer with AI? Or do I have a new idea that I want to use AI with? These should be looked at very, very differently. If I want an AI model and I want to toss all of our supply chain data in there in order to get new insights, it's a great idea, but it is very different than your project management tool that has AI in it. They are not the same. So please start to differentiate between these and then determine what you want to apply to it. Now, here's a matrix that you have to take these suggestions and then really apply them to your own organization, right? But I think the hardest part is, well, what does it look like? So I want to give those to you, and then you can customize them and make them your own. But here's a matrix, from high value, high risk to high risk, low value, and then all the way down to low risk, low value. Now, what I did here is we have examples of each of those so that you recognize what would fit in that matrix, and then also give you some thoughts as to what you would do. So if you're touching anything that's really autonomous, you're touching medical records, you're touching any type of credit scoring, any type of employment thing, that probably goes right up to the top. Now, another one would be facial recognition, that maybe it's low value, but it's high risk. So think about some different aspects of how these reviews come in and where they should go. Then we move to what are the types of tools that we would have as we do AI assessments. Well, I think we have a lot that are coming to market, right? So what we say today is going to be different than 6 months, but you have to have your eyes and ears looking at the market to see what's coming, because they're going to be helpful. But as I said, data governance is key. So data quality is going to be right at the top. You have to look at your algorithm that you're utilizing. And I think no matter what system you're under, whether it's Singapore, EU, US, Brazil, Canada, doesn't matter. These concepts are going to be key in that assessment. So we have to look at that transparency of the algorithm. So you better be building it in a consistent way with the note cards that I'm sure you may have come across from the EU. Fairness, we've got to somehow test for that. The privacy, obviously, has already been discussed, and then pure security. Who has access? Where is it? Where is it? Where is it shared? Where did we get it from? And those types of matters. So I think you have to continue to think about pure security on top of it. Two areas that I think are really good in terms of leading you through. I think the NIST framework is really good. That kind of gives you some good guidance, and then I think the OECD kind of really lays out the principles or the values you're looking for. So to me, one's a little bit more technical and the other one's more values-based. I think you have to begin automating this. This is no doubt that automation is required. So when we start looking at the areas that we need to test, we have to look for the automation tools that are coming. That's not just the data tools in terms of, is it accurate? Is it working correctly? Where did we get it? But it's also like the bias tools and those types of things. As I said, start with some easy cases and then build up. So here I wanted to just give you an overall view of just kind of how do you go about it. I really do think you have to begin with your data governance to understand where your data is. You have to figure out what the categories of risk are, and obviously look at likelihood and so forth. But I think you got to just start thinking about what the categories would look like. You have to work with all the stakeholders in the big table. A lot of people, all the way from ethics to data scientists to security, to all sort, sociologists and so forth. You have a lot of people who need to be at that table. And again, going back to the agility idea, you really have to be iterative in this process. So to me, ISO gives you, I think, the strongest format of that is I have to decide what I want out of what I'm doing. How am I going to test it? I'm going to test it. Then I'm going to create my corrective action plan, right? So you have to think in those minds, the eternal reoccurrence, if you might say, of what is it I'm trying to get? How am I going to test whether I'm getting it? Test, try, drop your corrective action plans, adjust, try again. So that's kind of the process I think you have to do with your assessments. And so let me move to the next one. And I believe that goes right over to John.
Yeah, John, before we have John Barker come on, we still have plenty of time, so I wanted to ask you a follow-up question. So in terms of the applications in a given organization that are most likely to require an assessment, what's your opinion as to what you think that most organizations are going to have to assess first?
I think you're going to want to know what software has AI in it, and you'll want to know some aspects of it, but I don't think that is where you should necessarily be pushing a lot of your review or your impact assessment to. I think you want to actually probably apply training to those things, right? Copilot's going to be there. You're not going to change it, so why not just train your people as to how to do it? Give them a model they can do it. Train them not to go out in public models and put client and sensitive data. What are we going to want to look at? The real ideas that really are going to move the organization: supply chain, customer data, marketing, sales, efficiencies within the legal department. These are the areas that we can already think of what we can do. So therefore, I think those are the ones you're going to spend time on, because we can do those now. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And I guess my follow-up question before we move on is the EU, as you know, with the AI Act, has its own distinct assessment requirements, and they have different kinds of assessment requirements. So you have this idea of a fundamental rights impact assessment. You have the regular, if you will, just AI impact assessment. So, and you have likely other things that you're going to have to do in order to get it certified to be able to be used in the EU. So does your formula change for that, or what's your opinion on that?
I think we get a working architecture and then we add on what we need in a particular country or region. I think we will follow a similar process of how we dealt with GDPR, right? So if you're an international company, you generally picked up GDPR as your privacy standard. But if you were dealing with China or Russia, you would add something on to it, right? If you're dealing with Brazil, you might have a slight tweak for it. But the reality is your model, your model, but your architecture, your process, your operation, you would pick the highest. So I think we're going to do the same thing. We're going to pick an operational model that's going to look like the EU AI Act. And so, for instance, like a good example would be like your model cards. Model cards you should be doing no matter if you're in the EU or not. And I think you're just going to do that because it's good practice. It's going to fulfill whatever the 50 states come up with in the US. I've got it documented. Now, if there's little nuances to Europe, you may not do those in the US, but I think the vast majority of it is going to be pretty similar. And even if they're not requesting it in the US, you'll pocket it because at some point they probably will.
Okay. And for the benefit of the audience, what is a model card?
It's a good question. So I think there's still kind of, I mean, obviously we're starting to see tools that have it, but in my mind, it is, I think it almost like what we might see in the GRC area, but it literally says everything we know about the model, from how we formed it to what is in it, what the risks are, what our corrective action plans or compensating controls, results from testing in the different environments. It would also incorporate protections we have, for bias or impact on society. It would also detail how we tested it for all the areas that we're supposed to fulfill. And then I would also say any type of issues that would happen after it's into prod would be documented in there along with the corrective action plans. So you would almost, I guess, an analogy would be it's the diary of a system, and you create a diary for every single model you make, and that is a very prized document for regulators.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. I kind of like to think of it as the owner's manual, if you will. Think about your car owner's manual. It's a little bit like that. So great. Thank you for that. Yeah, go ahead, David.
Yeah, actually, the way I think about it, John's explanation is excellent, and I would add to it, the way I think about it or explain to some of my clients, it's like when you go buy a car and they have that big sticker on the side and it tells you V8, what the mileage is, all that kind of stuff. At a high level, you can use the model card and kind of get a sense of, what it's about. And to John's point, it's like a diary too, that it tells you all that detail. And then Scott, getting back to your first question, I love John's answer. I just want to add that, sometimes for my clients, I'm talking about, two of the high risk or things I like to look at is their use of AI in human resources. And I think on one of the slides we had at the beginning, we said almost 100% of Fortune 500 companies are using AI somewhere in their human resources hiring process. And you saw what happens when people are using AI tools incorrectly to kick out people over a certain age. That's terrible. That's an important area. And the second one is chatbots. And so I think it's very forward facing, and using all of the things John is talking about to look at chatbots, how they're being used, what they're saying to users, how they're being testing. Are you red teaming? Because there's examples out there of chatbots that are giving incorrect information, and suits are being filed about, hey, your chatbot told me that I could get a discounted airfare, and that's incorrect, and the company doesn't want to honor that. So those two areas, in addition to the things that John Bates was talking about, I would say if I was in-house and looking at this, or for my clients, I say those are two areas I want to see. How are people using AI in those contexts? They're very forward-facing, and there's a lot of litigation like SEPA in California on chatbots as well. So.
Wonderful. Before we move on, we have an audience question. And again, audience members, please send your questions in. This is a great opportunity for you. Question is, and John, I'll send this to you. Do you recommend that third parties do this assessment, or is this something that should be done by the user themselves, or should there be both?
It's a good question. In my experience, the smaller organizations may have to have outsiders help, maybe in the beginning to, train the trainer type of situation, or that they will not get the funding or the resources. So it could be outsourced in that way. I also think outsiders could augment an internal team in a larger organization. And again, I think it's a lot of knowledge transfer of learning from an outsider, and then maybe you would take it over. I do think there's some advantages at some point when the outsider does look at your internal program, right? So keep that like separations of duty kind of architecture. But I think we're going to have both. And then obviously from the legal side, you can't turnkey this and toss it over the fence and not worry about it, because you're completely liable for whatever the outsider's doing. So I feel like just from that perspective, even if you do outsource it, you better keep a very close eye on it, because you're the one the regulator's going to call.
Excellent. What a great answer. Thank you for that.
And Scott, if I could add to that,
David. Yeah, please.
Really fast, I tell people it's hard to grade your own homework. And so what that means is, you have product teams and like, look, we got to get this out. It's going to be bring in millions of dollars. And it's hard to say, sometimes it's hard to say no. It depends on the politics internally of your organization. And you're going to have a sense of that. It's great to be able to third party to come in. There's great consulting firms, law firms that can help do that analysis and be the bad guy in the meeting to say your baby's ugly. And nobody wants to have to do that, but sometimes that's what is needed. You might be in an organization, and another analogy I love to use is sometimes you can tell a small child, don't touch the hot stove. Other times they have to touch the hot stove to learn what's bad. And your organization may not have gotten a fine, they may not have gotten regulatory action, and they just don't appreciate the problems that come after that. And so sometimes it's helpful to have that third party come in to say, look, if you don't do it this way, if you don't do an impact assessment, if you don't think about these things, there's going to be problems down the line, because we have other clients that are suffering right now and dealing with regulators on the exact same types of things. So just some things to think about. Again, hard to grade your own homework.
Yeah, that's excellent. And let me just bookend this before we move on to say that I've been in these meetings before, and politically, sometimes the only way to get change effectuated at an organization is to have a third party come in and say what you've been saying all along, but they have to hear it from someone else. So effectively, that may be necessary to make things work. So on that, let's send it over to John Barker, and let's talk about the board and the C-suite, which is something that's not talked about nearly enough, but he's going to go and tell us why it's so important.
Hello. So I'm going to mention a little bit about board and C-suite oversight over AI risk assessments. And you've probably heard the phrase fiduciary duties before, but actually when you are employed by an organization, you're subject to fiduciary duties. But the board members and the C-suite have heightened fiduciary duties. And it's often helpful to understand the core functions of a board. Of course, every company can adjust its own board duties for its specific situation, but we have a wonderful source of information, the Model Business Corporation Act, that has been adopted in several states, and it gives these basic board functions. The board oversees business performance, plans and strategy, risk management, hiring and evaluating executive officers. It's responsible for oversight of regulatory compliance, setting ethical standards, and testing to the soundness of financial statements, ensuring that there are effective internal controls. They also handle executive officer succession planning, the composition of the board and board committees, and it's highly likely you're going to have a compliance committee or an audit committee that whoever in your organization is doing risk assessments has some sort of criteria to determine which risks and impacts have to be escalated to the board. Obviously, the board cannot be involved in every risk assessment, but it does have to make sure that risk assessments are taking place and they are getting correct information through the appropriate reporting mechanisms, which they are also responsible for overseeing. I do want to note, let me get to the next slide. The basic fiduciary duties, you can think of fiduciary duties as standards of conduct for the board and the C-suite. And I do want to emphasize, there has been confusion about this, but board members and the C-suite, if you are a duly appointed corporate officer, you have the same fiduciary duties as board members. And some of your corporate officers are going to be on the board. One of the justices of the Delaware Supreme Court noted that fiduciary duties' purpose is to promote value maximizing functions. And that's one of my favorite phrases. The three basic duties are duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of good faith. Duty of care means that decision makers must make their decisions with due care, and this presupposes exercising reasonable due diligence, including reasonable efforts to seek information that supports a decision. And that implies the need for having reporting mechanisms and escalation criteria for when AI-related risks have to be reported to the board. The duty of loyalty. Decision makers must place the interest of the organizations they oversee and manage above their personal interests, and they must avoid or at least disclose any conflicts of interest. And finally, the duty of good faith is that decision makers must exercise their duties of care and loyalty in good faith. And there are different ways of expressing this standard, but generally it's making decisions that a reasonable or prudent person would make in similar circumstances. And when a board is dealing with a risk, they have to be informed of that risk. So your organization will need to establish those criteria. Now, I do want to note there is a concept in law, in Delaware law, called mission criticality, mission critical. It's already known that cybersecurity is a mission critical risk, and there is heightened scrutiny of what boards and C-suites are doing in terms of cybersecurity oversight. I believe that AI will become mission critical. It will become mission critical for what we could call an AI first business, but AI, as my colleagues have noted, will be embedded in everything. And therefore, it will be mission critical alongside cybersecurity. There's a famous case in Delaware called the Caremark case, and the Caremark case stated an extension of the traditional fiduciary duties. And that extension is called the duty of oversight. So boards are required by law to monitor and manage risk in good faith, and they may rely on duly appointed corporate officers and employees. They must have a reasonable monitoring system. Also, I want to note that if you are a duly appointed corporate officer, you have the same fiduciary duties as the board, and you are subject to that mission critical standard. And what we often forget is just by virtue of being an employee, you have some basic fiduciary duties to your organization that are stated in the common law, and we don't pay enough attention to that. So AI risk assessments are necessary for fulfilling fiduciary duties. And that's a brief overview. And any questions?
John, let me jump in here because I've
Yes.
got plenty of things I want to follow up with you on. So I
Yes,
want to really underscore what you've underscored is that it's not just directors that are on the hook now, it's also officers. And
that's
that's
right.
important because that's when we say officers, we mean CISO, but it could be also other officers. It could be the
That's
CIO.
right.
And
Mm-hmm.
in some
Right.
organizations, other officers have assumed the
Mm-hmm.
role of information security. So this is a change in our jurisprudence. This was not the case, say,
Mm-hmm.
10 years ago. What's
Mm-hmm.
changed in our jurisprudence that now potentially people on this call are on the hook for not
Mm-hmm.
interfacing with
That's
the
right.
board or not properly allowing that oversight to be communicated to the board so the board knows what questions to ask?
Exactly. Absolutely. And I believe we're also, even if you're not a duly appointed corporate officer, I think the stakes are going to be higher as well. Even if you're just an employee, let's say a director or a VP, carrying out your ethical responsibilities will be more important than ever in the context of AI. It's heightened benefit, but heightened risk. So we're really entering a new world. And I think we'll see some new theories of liability that we have not seen in the past. And also, I want to note that your insurance carrier will be paying attention to your corporate governance and your reporting structures. And your insurance carrier is going to be very interested in your AI risk assessments and cybersecurity assessments. So it affects all activities of the corporation. Your stakeholders also, your customers will also expect good governance as well in terms of AI.
Excellent. One final follow-up question with you about this
Mm-hmm.
idea is that we talked about a mission critical. This is a
Mm-hmm.
jurisprudential concept that's come up in
Mm-hmm.
the past, I don't
That's
know,
right.
five or so years.
Yes.
It's for many things, but it's for cybersecurity in particular.
Yes.
Why did this concept even come to the fore? How did we get here?
It actually developed in some interesting circumstances. So it has evolved, but it started that the language was if you are in a business that is called a monoline business, so it's just one aspect of business. The company involved was developing a new medical device and had the allegation was it had not disclosed negative test results to the FDA, which was approving the device. And the judge in that case said, this is a one-line business, and the line of business is its entire, this subject matter is its entire business. So if you are a monoline business in a highly regulated industry, then that the risk associated with the that line of business is called mission critical. And that concept has evolved. So initially, you could argue, oh, well, if we have multiple business lines, then the mission critical standard does not apply. So the doctrine has evolved where now they're saying cybersecurity is a mission critical risk for everyone. And I think we're going to see this with AI. So, if the higher the degree of regulation, the more likely you're going to see mission critical. So AI, let's say you have an AI first business, its entire business model is built on AI. Well, AI is absolutely mission critical. By contrast, if AI is not your main business, but you've only deployed chatbots, well, for customer service, perhaps you could argue it's not mission critical. But my recommendation is to treat everything as mission critical now in this digital world that we're living in.
Excellent.
I hope that
Excellent. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Let me ask the team before we move on. Team, comments, John Bates, David, comments about anything with directors, officers, and their liability, their being on the hook for AI risk assessments.
Well,
I
Scott,
think this is going to. Oh, go on.
Oh, no, go ahead, John. Go ahead.
I think this is going to stigmatize the CISO role further. I hear more and more CISOs asking about concepts like D&O, which I don't think they knew about. Well, and this is, Uber CISO, criminal actions, SolarWinds, we can go on and on. I believe CISOs are more and more hesitant to take these jobs. The pay, the salary is decreasing. The personal liability is increasing. And I think, as many people know, it's, the Rodney Dangerfield job where you get blamed for everything and no one really appreciates what you do. And I think that we're going to see that fall out in some way, especially when we toss AI on top of all of that weight. You're going to get poor candidates, or something is going to evolve out of that because people are already scared before you throw on AI.
Excellent. David, what do you think?
I think, and I think, and just after this past weekend, we all certainly appreciate our CISOs and that part of the organization after, the amount of work they had to do to get many of our computers back up and running again after that bad patch was downloaded. But I think, to your earlier question, Scott, you asked, well, what has changed in the legal or regulatory environment? And I think one of the things that's worth noting is the SEC's reporting requirements. They've clarified that some of the things that might be materially important to investors need to be reported. And so the focus, and John Bates touched on this a little bit with SolarWinds and other recent events, has been criminal actions for failure to report cyber events or report them adequately. But people kind of miss, or they're very focused on cyber, but what about privacy events? What about AI events? Mm-hmm. And so that's probably going to be the new focus in the next few years. If, pull out my crystal ball and say, well, what's going to happen? Right now it's cyber, but certainly those other things are reportable as well and important to the C-suite and your investors. So it's something, if you don't have the basics down, if you don't have these impact assessments, if you're not doing them, and you kind of don't know if your car has gas and you're going on this big road trip, you're going to have problems. And so it starts with the basics. And I think, in this presentation, a lot of good information about how to get there and how to do this bit by bit so that you can build a program that's defensible if you do have a problem down the line and you are sitting across the chair from somebody from the DOJ or a lawyer who is in a deposition, or an investor that said, how could this happen? If you don't have those impact assessments, if you don't have that basic stuff, you're going to have a tough time answering those questions. So just something to think about.
And Scott, I think one other thing too for people, there's definitely organizations and lawyers that are, I think, telling their leadership we don't have any exposure under AI. And I think what they don't appreciate is the FTC. You touch the public in some way, and the FTC is absolutely a very strong and active advocate for that which they have jurisdiction over. You may say they are more active than the SEC in many ways. So I think the parties that really think they don't have any exposure under this may be surprised when the FTC has the resources to find them.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's interesting because there's this discussion lately about, well, in our terms and conditions, we've limited our liability to $100 or whatever it is, and therefore we're going to be good. I think the FTC is not really going to care what the limitation of liability is on your terms and conditions. They're going to look at the impact to the public. So you're absolutely right. The idea that these folks are going to somehow skate from any liability, I think, is just wrong. So it's an excellent point. Wonderful. Let's do this. Let me go on and talk about the NIST AI RMF. This is something I've spent a lot of time with, so I want to go over it briefly with all of you. And also, like I said, if you have questions, send them in. We love to answer them. So just a little bit of background on RMF. So this was released in January 2023, about 60 days after ChatGPT 3, so or 3.5, I forget which one, but very fortuitously. Now it had been worked on for years prior to that. So in fact, U.S. federal government passed this Congress passed a law in 2020 about artificial intelligence. So I have to give them props that they were ahead of the game here. And this is not unlike other NIST risk management frameworks. We already have the CSF, we've got the privacy framework. This is another one, and so it's set up in a very similar fashion. And three core aspects that you should know: it's rights preserving, meaning personal rights. It has to be flexibly applied and can be flexibly applied, which is great. And then everything has to be measurable, because as the old saying about what gets measured gets managed, etc., that's exactly the same thing here. So that's it in a nutshell. Let's talk about the different actors, if you will. This is part of the jargon that NIST uses. They could talk about the audience, so they talk about the AI actors. And so what the actors are in this case are all the people involved in developing or deploying the AI, and they break it among 7 different categories here. So you can see where they have the plan and design stage, and all the various stages they run through. Not terribly surprising that information security, the cybersecurity team, is relevant in almost all of these areas here. And so what you'll see is below each functional area, they have the activities, and then they have all the players. You are, of course, one of these players in almost all of these phases here. And in terms of what NIST thinks are characteristics of trustworthy AI, you can see the series here, one of which, not terribly surprising, is secure and resilient. And it's interesting because that idea of not just security, but resiliency keeps coming up. It came up in the EU AI Act, where they talk about security, resiliency, robustness. So they use these terms somewhat overlappingly. Here, NIST is very clear. Resilience is the ability to return to a normal function after an event. Security incorporates resilience, but it has all these other components like to avoid, protect, respond, recover, etc. So it's an interesting dichotomy they've set up. I think the EU conflated a lot of these and didn't really tell you what resilience means or what robustness means, but they did a good job of it here, and it helps us all with our missions. Next point I want to make here is this idea of security and resilience. This is universal. Every time that you're having to do an assessment, no matter what set of criteria you're using, what kind of standards you're measuring it against, you're all going to have that. And so you can see here the RMF has it, OECD has it, the EU Act has it, they all have it. So this is germane regardless of what standard or what criteria or what anything might be involved. And in terms of the structure structure of the RMF. So you have this idea of governance being at the core. This is a new idea. Governance has always been part of these risk management frameworks, but now NIST has changed. They've just put governance right at the core, and then everything else is a satellite, if you will. And so I think it's an interesting dynamic how they've changed this. I think it's good because without governance, nothing else works. And quite frankly, you have to have your governments set up initially, at least in your first trial, to make sure that you know who's supposed to be doing what. And so here, governance is central, and then the other things revolve around it. So I like it already. It's got a lot. It's got a lot to really be a good advocate for. And then when you break down these different functions, these core functions, and again, if you're familiar with the CSF, use the same idea. You have core functions here. Here, I mentioned earlier about governance. When we talk about governance, we talk about their structure. So if you had to think about a word and governance wasn't too clear, it's all about structure. So you've got the policies, procedures, you've got the practices in place, and they're actually implemented effectively. So they're just not shelfware. They're there. They're available. They're being used. They're being enforced. Then the idea of mapping. So I think about mapping in the sense of proactive intelligence. So you have sufficient data to inform whether you're going to do a go, no go about whether you deploy this, or whether you continue designing it, or whether you continue going to the next stage in that 7-stage model that I showed you earlier. Measure is just telemetry. Do you have the tools necessary to measure the risk, both qualitative and quantitative? And qualitative, easier, but quantitative is just important. Sometimes you can get a feel that something is wrong. You can't put your finger on it, but you know that there's something wrong, and it's really an indicia that you need to dig deeper to be able to uncover whether you really should deploy this. So you have to have both qualitative and quantitative telemetry. And then finally, this idea of managing. I like to think of managing as prioritize and execute. So you've got your risks, you've lined up, and you're prioritizing them, you're responding to them, you're managing them. And there's a mechanism to measure in and of itself whether you're prioritizing and executing correctly. So before I go on and dig into InfoSec vis-a-vis the RMF, team, do you have any comments about anything that I've talked about thus far?
Yeah, I think, Scott, you excellent kind of laying the foundation for the importance of the NIST RMF. And also, I don't know if you can get to the playbook, but again, another very helpful tool for people to kind of look and think about the risks that their organization has, and then to craft their AI impact assessment. I also liked when you said, this shouldn't just be on the shelf. A lot of there's some practitioners out there that think that they can just pump out a memo, and as I say, like they're giving their kids a manual of how to swim and throwing them into the deep end of the pool. And so I think this is that's 100% the wrong approach. If you're going to use NIST or any of these other frameworks, really want to be involved as a practitioner and help the teams assess the risk and work through these things and understand how it fits in the context of the regulations that your entity or your sector has to comply with. And again, it gets back to that structure. And you need to get to a structure where you do have the teams working together and not just, oh, here's a memo about what the law is, lots of luck. That's 100% the wrong approach.
Wonderful, wonderful. Team, any other comments or thoughts about this?
I think the only thing just to augment a little bit more on that point is that the effectiveness of what we're talking about, especially in terms of governance, is going to be directly related to whether people can play nice in the sandbox. And it has a humanist aspect because it just like we know with cyber, right? It's always playing with the weakest points, right? In terms of vectors of attack. Well, the governance and the effectiveness is directly related to how well, however you split your organization up, can a lot of people work together in order to figure this out. If they can't work together, your governance isn't going to work. And it's pure and simple in that. And so it is going to test whether, and that's why I gotta say play in the sandbox. Can people play nice across maybe 10 to 12 different departments in order to figure this out? It's big.
Wonderful. Yes, excellent. Thank you. It's spot on. Let me do this.
And
let
Scott,
me go on. Oh, go ahead, Dave.
Just add one other thing really fast and build
Sure.
on what John is talking about here. is, the AI impact assessments or privacy impact assessments, they're all part of the story you're going to tell. And it's part of your governance structure. And so what you want to kind of do, and it's important, is you have these things over time. So before you launch a product, you can show an AI impact assessment. And then towards the end, when maybe you left some features off the table, you said, we're going to get this out in H2, but we're launching in H1, and here's the limited set. You have to revisit that AI impact assessment, what you're actually going to launch. And so that's part of your governance too, is saying, look, these are not just like you saying, put it on the shelf, do it once and leave it alone. They have to stay evergreen. And so if you're going to have a product out there, because what's a little bit different about AI systems is that you might have drift. And so the model may be acting a certain way and be responding in a certain way. And then maybe there's an update, maybe there's new training data, and suddenly the model starts doing stuff that maybe wasn't there before. And especially for chatbots and other things like that, it's again, you need to keep it evergreen as part of your governance strategy, and you need to kind of revisit these things on a regular basis to show a history of compliance. So that if some regulator comes along 6 months from now and say a year from now, 2 years from now, it's not like, oh, we just did our impact assessment last week. That's terrible. You need to get, you need to have a system in place so that you're notified when a new product, a new service, a new partner is being onboarded that's using this technology, so that you can get the impact assessment in beforehand and either address or mitigate, or maybe the business is going to say, hey, we're going to eat that risk. But either way, you want that documentation in place beforehand so that you can show diligence and you can show you're doing your governance the right way.
Spot on. Thank you. That was awesome. Let me do this because we've got about 4 minutes left, so I just want to cover a couple final points, and then we'll wrap up here. So some questions for the audience to consider. These are the questions that were asked by the RMF itself, and they're all dealing with: is there a human that's being incorporated, or is subject to, or is there personal data otherwise that's wrapped up in this whole AI process? That's not to say that you could have something completely devoid of personal information that does not create risk. I mean, we saw that back in 2008 with the credit crisis, but this really, in my view, raises the stakes for why these risk assessments are so important, because of the personal data and the personal impact and the personal everything that is implicated by everything that we're doing now with AI. And so when we talk about where does InfoSec fit in, they fit in everywhere, almost everywhere. So out of the 7 phases in the RMF, all but one, operate and monitor, the cybersecurity community has to be involved in. And you might say, well, how do we do that? So really the way it's going to work is that, for example, let's take plan and design. Okay, so you have different properties of trustworthiness like security by design, and then you have these questions that you have to consider. How will we build security into the system? You can see that there are AI RMF subcategories that are highlighted, things that you really want to pay particular attention to, and that's great. And then you start that process. You then continue by saying, okay, great. Okay, we've got the criteria, security by design, I just mentioned. We identify the standards or the mandates or the agreements, whatever it happens to be, like Article 15 of the AI Act or GDPR, what have you. So you have an idea of what you're being measured against. You identify the risk level. And then you ask these questions that I just showed you earlier. How do we build appropriate security into the system? How do we provide updates to the system? Then from there, you're going to say, okay, great. We're going to employ ISO 27X, whatever it might be. We're going to do quarterly updates. After which, you're going to say then, okay, coming back to reality, here's the deltas. Okay, we're only in our first year of ISO 27001. We haven't even gotten past certain points. We don't have the resources to do quarterly updates, whatever it is. You're going to identify that. That's going to be what's going to go visit it to the board. So very interesting stuff. You're going to go to the board and say, okay, these are the things we need because we don't have them, and we have to be able to do that if we want to go on and continue with our project. So this is a must-read resource. If you have not read this already, I highly recommend it. It's hugely helpful. And then really just in terms of summary and conclusions, really the most important thing I think takeaway for all of you here today is that this is like any other risk assessment in the sense that it's a fundamental component of a cybersecurity operation. It's going to be working with other components like a privacy risk assessment or an enterprise risk assessment or what have you. They're all intimately important in your entire risk assessment process. And it's something that you're going to have to be able to revisit periodically because the standards and the demands and the needs are going to change. And that's it in a nutshell. We're out of time here. And so I just want to put our email here. Feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn. We also have a resources deck here that's behind this that you can take a look at when you download it. And I'm going to turn this back over to Chris. So, Chris, thank you for having us. I think this was a delightful opportunity to get together.
Oh my gosh, Scott, the appreciation and gratitude is ours. Thank you to Scott, John, and David. What a fascinating and wonderful conversation. And as you can imagine, this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is something that will just keep on continuing to go on. And there is an opportunity for you to continue that conversation. We hope that you'll join us this September at the Disney Coronado Springs Resorts for InfoSec World, where John, Scott, and David will be taking part in sessions at the event. A general reminder, if you are needing CPE certificates, that will be sent out as soon as the event concludes. This event is also on demand, so if you'd like to revisit some of these wonderful key points that our panel has shared with you, it is at your fingertips, and please feel free to share those links with those colleagues who are not able to join us today. And so with that, just deep appreciation. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you for joining us for this webinar.